Here are 19 DP-203 Data Engineering on Microsoft Azure exam questions. Question 1. You plan to create an Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pool. You need to minimize the time it takes to identify queries that return confidential information as defined by the company's data privacy regulations and the users who executed the queries. Which two components should you include in the solution? A. Sensitivity classification labels applied to columns that contain confidential information. B. Resource tags for databases that contain confidential information. C. Audit logs sent to a log analytics workspace. D. Dynamic data masking for columns that contain confidential information. So in order to carry out what the question requires, we can follow the protocol that's outlined by data discovery and classification. This is something that's built into some Azure services, and one of them being Azure Synapse Analytics. So it's got few capabilities, and one of the capabilities is automatically detecting potentially sensitive data and giving you the option to review and apply sensitivity classification labels to them. If you know the sensitive columns already, we can apply sensitivity classification labels directly to them. So the part of this data discovery and classification is auditing, and this is done through Azure SQL auditing. So what it does is it tracks database events and writes them to an audit log. In that audit log, one of the information is that various sensitivity classification labels of the data, and an example is shown on the screen right now. So going back to the question, the two components we should include in our solution is A. Sensitivity classification labels applied to columns that contain confidential information, and C. Audit logs sent to a log analytics workspace. You have an Azure Data Factory version 2 resource named DF1. DF1 contains a linked service. You have an Azure Key Vault named Vault1 that contains an encryption key named Key1. You need to encrypt DF1 by using Key1. What should you do first? A. Add a private endpoint connection to Vault1. B. Enable Azure role-based access control on Vault1. C. Remove the linked service from DF1. D. Create a self-hosted integration runtime. So by default, the data in your data factory is encrypted with a randomly generated Microsoft managed key that is unique to your data factory. But if you would like extra security guarantees, what you can do is you can enable BYOK, short for Bring Your Own Key, with Customer Managed Keys feature in Azure Data Factory. So this is the relevant section here. And if we go down to enabling Customer Managed Keys, we see that a Customer Managed Key can only be configured on an empty data factory. And it does also say that the data factory can't contain any resources such as linked service, pipelines, and so on. So going back to our question, the correct answer here is C. Remove the linked service from DF1. Question 3. You develop data engineering solutions for a company. A project requires the deployment of data to Azure Data Lake storage. You need to implement role-based access control so that project members can manage the Azure Data Lake storage resources. Which three actions should you perform? A. Create security groups in Azure Active Directory and add project members. B. Configure end-user authentication for the Azure Data Lake storage account. C. Assign Azure AD security groups to Azure Data Lake storage. D. Configure service-to-service authentication for the Azure Data Lake storage account. E. Configure access control lists for the Azure Data Lake storage account. So for the project members to manage the Azure Data Lake storage resources, both Azure RBAC, so role-based access control, and ACLs, access control lists, must be set to fully enable access to data for users and security groups. So looking at the resource here, we see that securing data in Azure Data Lake storage is a three-step approach. And that's pretty funny because given that there are 4 bullet points here, well, going through the bullet points, we see that you start by creating security groups in Azure AD. And we assign that Azure AD security groups to Data Lake storage account. And Last thing to do is assign the Azure AD security groups as access control lists on the data lake storage file system. And the fourth is more of an optional step. You can also set an IP address range for clients that can access the data in data lake storage. So going back to our question, the relevant options are A, C, and E, and in the order of the first, second, and third step we just went through. Question 4. You are designing an Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pool. You need to ensure that you can audit access to personally identifiable information. What should you include in the solution? A. Column level security. B. Dynamic data masking. C. Row level security. D. Sensitivity classifications. We've got a free question on our hand here because this is very similar to question 1. So just to review really quickly, data discovery and classification is built into Azure Synapse Analytics. And one of the capabilities that it provides is auditing. And before doing so, what we need to do is we need to label sensitivity classifications to these confidential information. We'll apply the sensitivity classification labels before the auditing. The audit can return the sensitivity classification as one of the outputs. So the correct answer here is D, sensitivity classifications. Question 5. You have a data warehouse in Azure Synapse Analytics. You need to ensure that the data in the data warehouse is encrypted at rest. What should you enable? A. Advanced data security for this database. B. Transparent data encryption. C. Secure transfer required. D. Dynamic data masking. Not to be confused with the record label that Kendrick Lamar is signed to, Top Dog Entertainment, TDE, but the transparent data encryption encrypts SQL Server, Azure SQL Database, and Azure Synapse Analytics data files. And this encryption is known as encrypting data at rest. So the correct answer here is B, transparent data encryption, TDE. All the other options are relevant to security, but not to do with encryption. So going through the other options here, A, advanced data security is a vulnerability assessment and advanced threat protection. Secure transfer required is something you enable when you want your storage account to accept requests from secure connections. Dynamic data masking limits sensitive data exposure by masking it to non-privileged users. So all to do with security, but TDE takes the cake. Question 6. You have an Azure Synapse Analytics Apache Spark pool named Pool 1. You plan to load JSON files from an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 container into the tables in Pool 1. The structure and data types vary by file. You need to load the files into tables. The solution must maintain the source data types. What should you do? A. Use a conditional split transformation in an Azure Synapse data flow. B. Use a get metadata activity in Azure Data Factory. C. Load the data by using the open row set transact SQL command in an Azure Synapse Analytics serverless SQL pool. D. Load the data by using PySpark. Notice in the question, we want to load the files into an Apache Spark pool. When we want to load data into a Spark pool, we can use the Spark itself. So the correct answer here is D. Load the data by using PySpark. Question 7. You have an Azure Databricks workspace named Workspace 1 in the standard pricing tier. Workspace 1 contains an all-purpose cluster named Cluster 1. You need to reduce the time it takes for Cluster 1 to start and scale up. The solution must minimize costs. What should you do first? A. Configure a global init script for Workspace 1. B. Create the cluster policy in Workspace 1. C. Upgrade Workspace 1 to the premium pricing tier. D. Create a pool in Workspace 1. So thinking about the cluster lifecycles in Databricks, by default Databricks acquires the virtual machine instances from the cloud provider. This is cost-effective but slow. So there's this thing called pools in Databricks. Pools are a managed cache of virtual machine instances. So between a cluster and the cloud provider, there sits a Databricks pools. So when a cluster is attached to a pool, Virtual machine instances are acquired from the pool if enough idle instances are available. So with pools, you can find that the cluster start time and auto scaling time will speed up on Databricks. It's especially effective in running shorter jobs in data pipeline. How we attach a cluster to a pool is also quite easy. In the clusters icon, there's a pools tab and you can click it and get started on it. So the correct answer here is D. Create a pool in workspace 1. Question 8. You're building an Azure Stream Analytics job that queries reference data from a product catalog file. The file is updated daily. The reference data input details and the storage account container view are shown below. You need to configure the Stream Analytics job to pick up the new reference data. What should you configure? There are two parts to this question, the first part being the path pattern and the other one being the date format. Both of these questions can be answered by looking at the storage account container view. So if you look at the location section there, it says ref data \2020 March 20. So in that location, we see that the path pattern is date \product.csv. Furthermore, looking at the format the date is written, we can see that year, month, and the day are separated by dashes. So looking at our answer here, for the path pattern, we choose the first option, and date format, we choose the fourth option. Question 9. You have the following Azure Stream Analytics query. For each of the following statements, select yes if the statement is true, otherwise select no. So we're given 3 statements here. We'll go through them one by one. The first one asks, the query combines 2 streams of partition data. Indeed, we see that we get 2 streams of partition data, step 1 and step 2. And in the second paragraph, using union, these are combined. So it's a yes. The second statement says, the stream, scheme key, and count must match the output scheme. When joining 2 streams of repartitioned data, the streams must have the same partition key and count. The outcome is a stream that has the same partition scheme. So this is also yes. The third and last statement says, providing 60 streaming units will optimize the performance of the query. So the number of streaming units must be adjusted according to the physical resources needed for each partition. In general, 6 streaming units are needed for each partition. So looking at this, we're given 10 partitions here. So doing some high-level mathematics, 6 times 10, we get 60 streaming units to optimize the performance. So the answer for this is also yes. Question 10. You're building a database in an Azure Synapse Analytics serverless SQL pool. You have data stored in Parquet files in an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 container. Records are structured as shown in the following sample. The records contain 2 applicants at most. You need to build a table that includes only the addressed fields. How should you complete the transact SQL statement? To start off, the create external table command creates an external table for Synapse SQL to access data stored in Azure Blob Storage or Azure Data Lake Storage. So that answers the first question. And for the second question, within the serverless SQL pool resource, the open row set function allows you to access files in Azure Storage. So open row set option is the correct answer. Going through the other options, cross apply and open JSON here. The cross apply is one of the apply functions which allows you to invoke a table valued function for each row. So it's not relevant in this case. Lastly, the open JSON function parses JSON text and returns objects and properties from the JSON input as rows and columns. Great way to translate JSON files, but again, it's not relevant in this question. Question 11. You have an Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pool named Pool1 and an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 account named Account1. You plan to access the files in Account1 by using an external table. You need to create a data source in Pool1 that you can reference when you create the external table. How should you complete the transact SQL statement? Let us first look at the location, which provides the connectivity protocol and path to the external data source. The pattern shown on the screen can be used in location. If you look at the Azure Data Lake Store Gen 2 as the external data source, The storage account name is followed by DFS. So that answers the first question. Moving on to the second question, for a dedicated SQL pool, the type should be Hadoop. And it should be noted that it can't be used in a serverless SQL pool. Question 12, you have an Azure subscription that contains an Azure Blob Storage account named Storage1 and an Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pool named Pool1. You need to store data in Storage1. The data will be read by Pool1. The solution must meet the following requirements. Enable Pool1 to skip columns and rows that are unnecessary in a query. Automatically create column statistics. Minimize the size of files. Which type of file should you use? A. JSON. B. Parquet. C. Avro. D. CSV. Looking at the first requirement, we see that the data should have columns and rows. So we can rule out JSON as one of the options here. For the second requirement, we need to automatically create column statistics. For CSV, we need to manually create column statistics. So we can rule out CSV, and the only option that can automatically create column statistics is Parquet. So the correct answer here is B. Question 13. You plan to create a table in an Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pool. Data in the table will be retained for 5 years. Once a year, data that is older than 5 years will be deleted. You need to ensure that the data is distributed evenly across partitions. The solution must minimize the amount of time required to delete old data. How should you complete the transact SQL statement? This question requires us to know about distribution and partition. For distribution, we're given 3 options here: hash, round robin, and replicate. Well, the default distribution is round robin, but we see here that we're given the distribution column. The only distribution option that takes a distribution column is hash distribution. So our distribution is hash. Moving on to the partition section. In most cases, table partitions are created on the date column. So looking at our options here, we're given customer key, order date key, and sales order number. So the correct answer for partition is order date key. And looking at the partition values here, we can see that it's in the date key format. Question 14. You have an Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pool that contains a table named Table1. You have files that are ingested and loaded into an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 container named Container1. You plan to insert data from the files in Container1 to Table1 and transform the data. Each row of data in the files will produce one row in the serving layer of Table1. You need to ensure that when the source data files are loaded to Container1, the date time is stored as an additional column in Table1. Question is, in an Azure Synapse Analytics pipeline, you use a get metadata activity that retrieves the date time of the files. Does this meet the goal? Yes or no? You can use the get metadata activity to retrieve the metadata of any data in either Azure Data Factory or a Synapse pipeline. On the screen, we're showing the connector and the available metadata. So in our case, we can use get metadata activity to retrieve the date time of the files to add in table 1. So the answer is yes. Question 15. You have an Azure Data Lake storage account that contains a staging zone. You need to design a daily process to ingest incremental data from the staging zone, transform the data by executing an R script, and then insert the transformed data into a data warehouse in Azure Synapse Analytics. The question asks, you use an Azure Data Factory schedule trigger to execute a pipeline that executes a mapping data flow, and then insert the data into the data warehouse. Does this meet the goal? If you want a programmatic interface using Data Factory, the language support includes .NET, PowerShell, Python, and REST. So clearly R isn't one of them. If you need to transform data in a way that is not supported by Data Factory, you can create a custom activity with your own data processing logic and use the activity in the pipeline. But here, the answer is no. R scripts aren't supported by Azure Data Factory. Question 16. The situation of the question is the same as question 15. Question 16 asks, you schedule an Azure Databricks job that executes an R notebook and then insert the data into the data warehouse. Does this meet the goal? R is one of the languages supported by Databricks, alongside Python, Scala, Java, and SQL. So what we can do is we can execute our code in a notebook and then call it from Databricks job. So the answer is yes. Question 17. You plan to create an Azure Data Factory pipeline that will include a mapping data flow. You have JSON data containing objects that have nested arrays. You need to transform the JSON formatted data into a tabular dataset. The dataset must have one row for each item in the arrays. Which transformation method should you use in the mapping data flow? A. ubranch, B. unpivot, C. outer row, D. flatten. The question is about data flow transformations. The options given here are some of the many transformations that's available. In this question, what's required is we need to unroll a JSON data format into a table format with individual rows. So when we want to take array values inside a data format with hierarchical structures, like JSON, and unroll them into individual rows, the process is known as denormalization. For that, we can use the flatten transformation. So the correct answer here is D, flatten. Just going through the other options here, new branch. We would use a new branch transformation when we want to do multiple sets of operations and transformations against the same data stream. It's useful when you want to use the same source for multiple syncs or for self-joining data together. Unpivot is used to turn an unnormalized dataset into a more normalized version by expanding values from multiple columns in a single record into multiple records with the same values in a single column. This is very confusing, but the best way to show this is by the example shown on the screen. Outer row is used to set insert, delete, update, and upsert policies on rows. Question 18. You have an Azure subscription that contains a logical Microsoft SQL server named Server 1. Server 1 hosts an Azure Synapse Analytics SQL dedicated pool named Pool 1. You need to recommend a transparent data encryption solution for Server 1. The solution must meet the following requirements. Track the usage of encryption keys. Maintain the access of client apps to Pool 1 in the event of an Azure Data Center outage that affects the availability of the encryption keys. What should you include in the recommendation? The first to consider is how to track encryption key usage. Using TDE with Customer Managed Key enables Bring Your Own Key, or BYOK, scenario for data protection at rest. With Customer Managed TDE, the customer has the full control of key lifecycle management, key usage permission, and auditing. So the correct answer for the first question is TDE with Customer Managed Keys. How do we maintain the client app access in the event of a data center outage? So the Azure recommends that link each server with 2 key vaults that reside in different regions and hold the same key material to ensure high availability of encrypted databases. When we mark the key from one of the key vaults as the TDE protector, system will automatically switch to the key vault in the second region with the same key material if there is an outage affecting the key vault in their first region. So the correct answer here is create and configure Azure key vaults in 2 Azure regions. Question 19. You have an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 account named ADLS2 that is protected by a virtual network. You're designing a SQL pool in Azure Synapse that will use ADLS2 as a source. What should you use to authenticate ADLS2? A. An Azure Active Directory user, B. a shared key, C. a shared access signature, D. a managed identity. All the options here are all supported authentication mechanisms. Going through one by one here, an Azure Active Directory is a cloud-based identity and access management service. So it's not the correct answer here. Shared key is used to get access to blob, queue, and file services. So it's not the correct answer here either. A shared access signature, or more commonly known as SAS is for access to Azure storage resources. So we're getting close, but it's not quite there either. Finally, managed identity authentication is required when your storage account is attached to VNet. So the correct answer here is D, a managed identity. Thank you for staying till the end, guys. It would mean a lot if you could like and subscribe. We got this together, guys. Love ya.